Well, welcome everyone to the May edition of Tennessee Turf Tuesday. I'm Dr. Jim Brosnan with the University of Tennessee, and really excited to be here with some of my colleagues today, not only from Tennessee, but from elsewhere. With Matt Elmore from Rutgers is here. How you doing, Matt?
Doing great. Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Brandon Horvath, my colleague in pathology, to talk all things Poa annua. We're both Poa annua enthusiasts. He's here. How you doing, Brandon?
I'm doing good, Jim. Good to see you.
And my longtime assistant, Greg Breeden, who we both have an interest in this weed or turf, or I guess species is probably the best way to call it. Greg, how you doing today, Greg?
I'm doing great. Looking forward to a good session today.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Before we get into the kind of what everybody wants to talk about, let me go through some of the particulars about pesticide credits and pesticide credit registration and all that stuff. So this series has been expanded in 2021. I think we have credits now in 12 or 13 different states. All of that information should have been captured at registration. So when you came through and did your registration, you were asked questions about what state you wanted to have pesticide credits in and your pesticide license number. So we should have all that. Zoom does track how long you are in our session, so please stay with us for the duration of the hour in order to get your pesticide credits, because the roster that Zoom populates is what will be submitted to the different state agencies to ensure that you get the pesticide credits that you are interested in. Only kind of wrinkle out there is if we do have New Jersey attendees, and I know with Dr. Elmore here, we may have several from New Jersey. To receive pesticide credits in New Jersey, the process is a little different. We're going to need for you to take a photo, a time-stamped photo with your ID at the beginning of this session, and then send that to myself or Dr. Elmore. And then we're going to need you to do the same thing at the end, a time-stamped photo with your ID at the end of the session to identify that you were with us for the duration. And you may see some quizzes and Q&A boxes come up as well as we go through this today. I should say too that pesticide credits are only for live viewings. All of these sessions are recorded and placed on our UT Turfgrass YouTube channel. So if you are watching this on YouTube, there are no pesticide credits for a YouTube viewing. It's only for our live viewings. If you are interested in GCSAA certification credits, I will put up the GCSAA code at the end of the session for you to report to the GCSAA website. And then last but not least, questions. I encourage anyone who has any questions to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This is a lot more helpful than using chat. It keeps the questions and the answers threaded together, so those that ask a question can see the immediate answer. As we've done more of these, when it's come through in chat or other platforms, just the information can be lost. So if you do have a specific question, please use the Q&A box to ask it, and we will do our best to address it. On the topic of questions, you know, one of the things that I joke about a lot with the folks here is that Poa is the most interesting weed or the most interesting turf. And I think we've seen that from you all joining us today. I've several questions already via email of things to cover. I don't know that we have all the answers, but I think everybody here enjoys talking about this plant. So I'm just going to start with probably our most complicated question. It comes from Ireland. And the question is, can you speak about Poa control in fine fescue plots? Is there any control methods for removing Poa selectively in fine fescue? Well, Matt, we don't have a lot of fine fescue in Tennessee, so I'm going to punt to you on this one. You got any thoughts on that from the jump?
Yeah, It's challenging for sure. I mean, I think one of the things that hampers you is the lack of herbicide options available. But one of the things that I think we find with herbicides, especially on fairways and putting greens, is that unless you're working in some cultural practices and trying to get those things situated so that you can promote the fine fescue growth compared to the annual bluegrass, then it's going to be difficult to manage no matter what. So, we don't have a lot of fine fescue here in New Jersey either. It's typically a low maintenance grass, in naturalized areas where you're not going to mow it. There are a few golf courses that have it. But I think the biggest thing is we could talk about, cultural practices, and that might kind of set the table for some of our discussions as we go. In Ireland, it could be probably even more difficult to use cultural practices than in New Jersey. I'd say, the biggest thing that we have at our disposal, maybe, especially in cool season turf, is the fact that, annual bluegrass is not as drought tolerant as most of our desirable grasses. And so, can you take advantage of that and reduce your irrigation frequency if you get a dry period? I think it depends where you are in Ireland. Maybe the western side is a little bit wetter. You may not ever have an opportunity really to stress that annual bluegrass with some drought. But that would probably be the biggest thing to consider, is especially, maybe not so much if you get a drought in early spring, but especially if you can get a drought in the middle of the summertime. Can you sort of push it a little bit and keep that fine fescue healthy and let some of that annual bluegrass succumb to drought stress?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise good points, and one of the things we've been working on here is, kind of the mantra in the Southeast is, well, the Poa just checks out when it gets hot. And that's a little nondescript, right? My PhD student, Devin Carroll, her focus of her work is trying to understand a little bit more about perenniality within Poa annua. What are the factors that confer survival over time? And then the inverse of that, what are the environmental factors that maybe might take a species that wants to persist and have it not persist? And it's been interesting, one of the things that she's done in her research is look at elevated root zone temperatures, where you can take Poa annua at elevated root zone temperature. And I think we had 70, 80, 90, and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And even at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, it took 14 days for the plants to die. And we did not have complete kill at continued exposure at 90. And then everything at 80 continued exposure lived, and obviously 70 lived as well. And the takeaway from that is that it's got to be more than just heat stress. So now we're trying to layer in, like, is it heat plus drought? Like, what is the matrix of killing conditions of environmental factors that might do this? And I know, Brandon, you and I have talked that it might be heat, drought, and pathogen, right?
Yeah, for sure. Certainly some of the pathogens that occur on annual bluegrass are going to play a role. Depending on which pathologist you talk to, anthracnose is often viewed as one of those pathogens that, while it can certainly be a direct pathogenic cause of disease, and that it's problematic, especially in areas where you're trying to maintain annual bluegrass as a turf. It can also be one that kind of comes into a stressed population of plants and finishes the job. And I know Dr. Couch always listed it as a synectopathic type of pathogen, where you've got a plant that's senescing, it's under stress, it's already kind of starting to check out, and then anthracnose comes in and kind of finishes off the job. So that can certainly play a role. And I think the other point that we need to make is, whether it's the person that asked the question in Ireland, or if anybody else, is that there's probably a tipping point, and I don't exactly know, and you guys might be able to offer up some guesses. I've got some ideas, but there's probably a tipping point where you need to stop kind of trying to get rid of it and start dealing with it as a potentially desirable turf, because at some point you get you get to a situation where you have so much in the stand that if you keep trying to get rid of it, you end up injuring enough of your desirable turf, or the turf that you think is desirable, that you the outcome isn't desirable on either side of that equation. So there's probably some, and my guess would be that it's somewhere in the 20-ish% range, because, you know, I don't think we have a real good handle on that. But that tipping point is something to pay attention to in terms of, you know, trying to get rid of it versus trying to keep it around.
Well, and Matt, you've kind of seen that with your work in cool season turf, right? That I know, like, some of the stuff you've done with trim it programs in the summer in New Jersey and you know, the Mid-Atlantic. I think you've told me before, like, you've got to tolerate a little bit of turf injury if you want to make any progress on POA removal.
Yeah, I think anytime you're looking to remove POA, whether it's with a herbicide or some of these cultural things, you know, to Brandon's point, you have to think, okay, whenever this POA checks out, do we have a desirable turf species that's going to be able to compete and fill the void that it left? And, you know, I think, like you said, Brandon, is at 20%. It could depend on how well that POA is mixed with the desirable grass. Sometimes, you know, we can get these large patches of annual bluegrass where there's almost no desirable grass in there. And that's a situation where you either need to decide, okay, I'm going to manage this as a desirable, or we're going to physically, you know, plug it out or whatever. Right. And then sometimes you can get situations where that, let's say fine fescue or bluegrass or excuse me, Kentucky bluegrass or whatever is mixed very well. And in that case, I think, you know, you can probably make better progress with a trim it program or whatever it is. And you especially have to think about this, you know, late into the summer and in the fall, whenever we're, you know, that annual bluegrass seed is going to germinate. Even if you've killed it, if you don't have desirable turf cover there, I just think, you know, you're going to be right back where you started the next spring.
Yeah, that happened before COVID happened. I spent some time down in South Africa and interacted with some folks in Johannesburg where they were trying to get rid of their POA green. They had beautiful POA greens. I mean, fantastic. And their desire was to try to get rid of it. And so they used a herbicide that's popular for trying to remove large amounts of POA in a, you know, a slow fashion, if you will. What happened was they got rid of all the POA. It worked great. And they had, you know, bent grass turf cover on about 25 or 30% of their greens. They weren't real happy with that for obvious reasons. And then we asked them, so what came back? They said, well, we seeded bent grass, but we got a lot of POA back. And so then we started talking about, well, maybe something like a trim it program. If the goal is to get rid of POA over time and you just want to move towards having more bent grass, then maybe that's the better strategy rather than trying to wholesale remove it. But like you said, to your point, like in areas where you have a large patch that's almost 100% POA, if your desire is to get rid of that, then that's more of a mechanical operation and a reestablishment of that area, whether it's from sod or from a nursery or whatever. That's certainly an option, but when it's mixed and throughout the stand, that becomes very tough to do, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's almost like nature trying to tell you what wants to be there too, right? You know, we've talked a lot about here, you know, you think about, why do we have persistence of POA on greens versus maybe in this climate in Tennessee, we don't see it persist throughout the summer at scale on fairways. And well, the traditional kind of dogma is, well, that's because some ecotypes are perennial and some are annual. And I think the longer we've dug into this, and I shouldn't say we, the more that Devin has dug into this for her PhD, we're kind of understanding that there's not a whole lot of hard evidence to support that paradigm of perennial versus annual ecotypes. It's more kind of the environment, and does the environment of the putting green allow for perennial survival, whether that's the fact that we're in a sand-based root zone that will hold some moisture and it's going to have supplemental irrigation because it's a putting surface anyways, and then maybe as undergrowth regulator that's going to help with overall stress tolerance and get a fungicide application to help with disease in the summer. Whereas you get further out, you know, you're at the 150-yard marker in the middle of the fairway. Now you don't have that sand-based root zone. We don't have an environment for root proliferation and underground carbohydrate storage. We're certainly not going to get supplemental irrigation as much as we would on a green. It just becomes really interesting to think about.
And in the Southeast, we're not doing, large scale fungicide applications to fairways. Yeah, so that's all of the old isms from Dr. Vargas just popped into my head. Is it cooler up on the green than down? I'm not going to do my impression, but is it cooler up on the green than down in the fairway, or what's different? And then the other one that popped into my head is when you talked about the perennial and annual was the debate that Dr. Vargas would often have with a student from the Southeast at Michigan State about how annual bluegrass, checks out in the heat. And then his retort would always be, well, there's this grass called Perennial Rye Grass that you also say checks out in the heat, and it's a perennial. And I think some of the stuff that Devin's finding with the perenniality in annual bluegrass is really compelling. That it's a lot more of a complex picture than it just gets hot and it just dies. It's not it absolutely is not a true annual that it sets seed and just dies. It's pretty clear that it's a typical perennial grass plant, and that there's environmental conditions under which it doesn't survive very well, much like crabgrass, right? If we have crabgrass in our area, we get a killing frost, it dies over the winter. The cold takes it out, right? But if you go down to the tropics, Digitaria is grown as a desirable turf.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And, and that kind of leads into the next question. And this comes from Tennessee. Somebody writing that they live south of Nashville and they noticed that they had no evidence of POA in their Bermuda grass. And then after a heavy snow and ice event in Nashville in the spring, it became a serious problem with largely mature plants that seem to appear out of nowhere. And I kind of think that links into some of this too, right? That yes, we will have emergence flushes of new seedlings each fall, but there's a potential where some of those plants might act a lot like rough-stock bluegrass and just kind of go dormant in the summer. And then, you think about if you're making a pre-emergence application in Bermuda grass in September, if that plant is there and you might not see it above ground, but it's rooted an inch or two into the soil, that root tip's going to be beneath the herbicide barrier, and that plant's going to survive. It's real interesting to think about.
Yeah, Jim, I guess a question I have on that is, do you think that superintendents should be thinking a little bit about managing annual bluegrass, in the summertime in their fairways? Think about, okay, if we do have a lot of perennial biotypes that may be existing in these fairways, should I think about, letting these fairways dry out a little bit more? Obviously, you're not going to kill all the biotypes, but trying to, think about that more throughout the year instead of just fall and spring.
Yeah, for sure. I think that becomes part of the integrated management plan. And then, the other thing too, and Matt, you and I have talked about this a lot, is, particularly in warm season turf, herbicide mixtures, and that's usually positioned from a resistance management place of, well, I can take two herbicides from different mode of action groups and make that in a single application. And that's going to help me if I've got ALS resistant POA and I mix it with a cellulose biosynthesis inhibitor and a PS2 inhibitor. Well, then there's two different modes of action there to work on that ALS resistant biotype. And then any plants in that population that might be ALS susceptible, obviously then all three of those modes of action can work on them. And that's really, really useful. And maybe later I'll share some of the winning treatments from our POA work this year. But I also think that it's going to help with this potential perenniality piece too, that, if I go out in October with a mixture of, let's say, Revolver and Barricade, right? Well, now I've got a pre and a post in the same tank. The Revolver is going to act on any of those plants that might be there and be perennial. And then the Barricade will help for any newly germinating seedlings.
And the question just came in, and I think, appropriately answered here. So this is from Nick Wilson. He says, I have clients with fescue lawns and Poa scattered throughout the lawn, would a proper strategy be to apply a pre-emergent herbicide in August and skip fall aeration and seeding, and then aerate and seed in early spring? Would we need to do this over a couple of years to achieve complete eradication?
Ooh, that's a complicated one.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know that I could sit here and say, let's do spring seeding a tall fescue. I feel like that's
a dicey
not a
move.
not a road to go down. And
that's a strong play, Cotton.
yeah, not
How it
sure I'm
worked out
comfortable
for
with
him.
that one. You know, and we just don't have a whole lot of selective removal tools in fescue. I mean, Matt, I know when you were here, you did some work with mesotrione as a post alone and in mixtures with amicarbazone for removal in cool season turf, but that's just a hard ask, right?
Yeah, we've been doing some work with that here. We've been looking at mesotrione and amicarbazone in the spring, and then we've also done some work. Brad Park has done a lot of work looking at ProGrass programs, and so I agree. I think, you know, the raise in a spring seeding becomes challenging. It's just because you're dealing with weeds like crabgrass and all sorts of other things that are much more difficult to control in a seeded scenario, and could potentially, you know, be really problematic, because you'd have to skip your pre-emergent application in the spring and you're disturbing the lawn. But, you know, I think there are some opportunities to do some things in the fall, looking at, you know, again, Brad's done that work with ProGrass, which is ethofumicate. So it's also sold as Poa constrictor. And, you know, one of the nice things about fescue and ryegrass is they're actually very tolerant of ProGrass or ethofumicate. Even seedlings, young seedlings are tolerant. So you can start making applications, you know, within a few weeks after you seed. So let's say you want to seed in mid-August, early September, and then you can make, you know, multiple applications of ProGrass after those seedlings come up. And, you know, that can be a successful program. You could potentially follow that in the spring with applications of mesotrione and amicarbazone, but I might start with a big seeding event in the fall, if there are indeed voids in that canopy in late summer. If the turf grass is in relatively good shape, and then, you know, you could just look at ProGrass alone. But that's where I'd start to go with that.
Well, and Matt too, like, you know, tenacity is labeled for pre-POA control. And, you know, I know in like some of the cool season NTEP trials, a tenacity application at establishments fairly common.
Yeah.
I would think that if you were doing a lot of tall fescue overseeding, following that tenacity label and making that application around that seeded establishment could be pretty useful if you think you're managing yards that have a pretty ample Poa annua seed bank to be had.
Yeah, and that's another strategy. You could look at that as well. I think if you've got a severe Poa problem, we've seen the ethofumicate is more effective, but I think coupling a mesotrione and then following it with an ethofumicate could be another strategy. You know, multiple modes of action is always good. Multiple hammers, if you will. Yeah, that's a great point.
Well, and I think too, in a tall fescue yard situation, you know, I get more questions about rough stalk bluegrass than I do Poa annua. I know the same's true for you, Matt, and it's always, I don't know. You
well,
wish
another
you
question
wish
just
you
came
could have
in
a better answer.
Yeah, another question just came in about Poa and tall fescue not having a problem with it until the seed heads appear. So would a growth regulator be able to control seed heads? So that might be a good way to segue into talking about seed head control, not just in a higher cut of turf, but potentially on putting surfaces. And then there's another question from John Spraggs, who's in New Zealand. What have you seen from Poecure? We're still working on getting this product registered. And I answered John's question about the question that we were just answering regarding fescue. They have a herbicide, haloxafop. I don't know if we have it here in the States.
We don't have it in turf.
Yeah. So, and he talked about it, you know, it takes all grasses out except for fescue. But we're talking about tall fescue, not fine leaf fescue. And I don't know if there's a difference there in terms of the window, but so Poecure and also seed head control? What do you guys have on that?
I mean, Matt, you've been pretty aggressive with researching the winter applications, going out at a snow mold timing, right? With a proxy application to get a jump on seed head suppression in spring.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess just to set it up here, we're talking about Poa control or Poa seed head suppression in tall fescue. You could do these sorts of things, the growth regulators for seed head suppression, but typically, I think because of cost and practicality of making multiple applications, they're only performed on greens and then sometimes fairways. The other thing is proxy, which is the main seed head suppressing agent that's used a lot, is not labeled in lawns. So that depends. I don't know if we're in a lawn or not, but yeah, if we want to segue and talk about greens, a lot of that work from Sean Askew that was published a few years back now, I guess probably about 4 or 5 years, for the first time showed that, making an application of proxy or ethifon in the fall, or actually his were in winter, but that doing that dramatically improved seed head suppression. So you make an application, in the fall, in our case here in New Jersey, or if you're a little farther south, it could be late winter because we're not expecting snow cover or frozen greens. And then you follow that with 2 applications in the spring at the standard timing of 400 growing degree days or so. And that application in the fall dramatically improved the efficacy. We've done a little bit more work looking at that here in New Jersey, because Sean's work was done in Virginia. So myself and Zayden Raudenbush, formerly of Ohio State, did some work and found that it worked really well in this climate. Right now, we're doing some work to understand if that application, which in this area we applied in December when those snow mold fungicides are going out, if incorporating that, that fall application, winter application to the program gives you more flexibility in the spring, because the springtime, the challenge in getting these growth regulators out is, okay, 200 growing degree days, 400, you're looking at models, and then you're looking at whether the seed heads are in the boot, all this stuff. It's difficult to get good control. And so the question is, do we have more flexibility with those springtime applications if we've made an application in the fall? It seems like we do so far, but I think the big take home is just, if you're not making winter applications of these growth regulators and you're not happy with your seed head suppression, it's something you might want to consider.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting, just kind of tangentially related, that working in zoysia grass seed head suppression now, for fairways, we're seeing fall applications be the optimal timing. We don't know why, but it's just kind of really intriguing that making that application months before the flush is it giving us this desirable result. I think, Brandon, you said there was a Poecure question too from New Zealand, from John.
They're still trying to get the product registered, and he was wondering what your thoughts on Poecure, and there was a comment in the chat that I think is applicable for all of these kinds of things, as we do in turf pathology and you guys do in turf weed science, that a healthy turf is probably our first line of defense. And so making sure, like in a tall fescue stand, that you're mowing high enough, that you're if you're in a lawn care operation, one of the things that certainly could contribute to, if you have clients that maybe have really weedy lawns and they're going to seed, and then you're getting that seed in, on your mower and then going to other places, is some sanitation can help. There's plenty of seed in the seed bank, but that could help minimize the impact of that. If you have clients that you're trying to bring a lawn around and it's really weedy, getting the mower, maybe making that the end of the loop, or cleaning the mower, at a suitable location might be an option there. But yeah, Poecure and thoughts was one of the other questions that came in.
So, I mean, I'll start, Matt. You can chime in because we've both researched this in different use patterns. It's a great tool, but like all great tools, it has a limited use, right? And it's not going to fix every single problem. And one of the concerns I think many within the weed science community have is that the name doesn't do it any favors, that the name itself is going to position it as the cure to every potential POA problem and the only tool you'll ever need. And we know enough about this plant and its adaptability that's just going to position you into a spot where you don't want to be resistance management wise. I know we do a lot of resistance work in our lab, and we have seen this be a wonderful tool for controlling ALS resistant plants and glyphosate resistant plants and barricade resistance plants, and you name it. But we have other plants that have survived Poecure treatment because they have non-target site characteristics where they can survive multiple modes of action based on how they can metabolize herbicide. You think about the scenarios where Poecure is probably going to go into first. It's going to be bentgrass greens, where they really haven't had any tools other than trim it. And you can see where the abandonment of all of those maybe growth regulator / cultural practices that have made a little bit of headway in favoring the bentgrass and discouraging POA, they get thrown out. And now we're just going to spray Poecure. Well, that's problematic on a lot of levels, not only from selecting for resistant biotypes over time, but a lot of those practices just help the bentgrass and have healthy bentgrass. And you'd hate to see all that be just thrown out for the sake of making a chemical application. And, one of the things we've researched, and this is on the Poecure label, the reseeding interval into Poecure is fairly lengthy. And, if you get into a scenario where maybe you've underestimated how much POA you really have, kind of like Brandon, what you were alluding to from your time in South Africa,
that's exactly what happened.
That, now you've lost 40% of your greens canopy and you can't seed new bentgrass back into it. That's a big issue.
Yeah.
And then
the other thing is then the plants that come back, which are POA plants again, you've essentially committed a non-lethal application of a herbicide and selected for plants that will germinate into that same soil that
correct,
are there. And that's a whole nother ball of wax that raises a very ugly scenario down the road.
And where it's worked really well, at least in our trials, has been bentgrass greens, kind of a medium, you're not to the point where you're thinking about renovating, but you've got some POA in there, and you can come in after, say, a fall aerification, make 2 to 3 apps. You can make really, really positive headway in removing the POA in that environment. One of the things that we've seen in trial work is that the activity is really fall focused, that when we put this out in the spring on POA in bentgrass greens, you can get some activity, but it's a really limited window. Matt, I don't know if you've seen this in New Jersey, but once we have plants that begin to throw seed heads in a putting surface, we tend to lose our Poecure activity. You really have to have those apps be early before that happens, at least in the transition zone.
Yeah, I think we haven't done as much as you guys have, but I think the fall application program is generally the way to go. To your point, I think this is a valuable tool for bentgrass putting greens. And I think the other key thing I want to bring up is that if you are in a situation where, like you mentioned earlier, Brandon, POA becomes too much of the putting surface and you have not been able to shift your management toward a more pro bentgrass system because you're afraid of losing that annual bluegrass in the summertime, this might be a way to help you get there. Another way, if you're afraid I have too much annual bluegrass in the putting surface, is to look at something like a trim it program to get you to a point where you can say, okay, now I'm comfortable making a Poecure application. And then you can start to incorporate some things like, some of the cultural practices as well. Like, okay, well, maybe once I get enough bentgrass, a little bit of anthracnose might be okay. I can dry these putting surfaces out more. I don't know if I don't want to just say it's okay to let a disease go, Brandon, but I'm thinking those are the types of things.
That's what my master's project was on, and I was terrible at it. I'm much better at getting disease on purpose and then trying to figure out how to control it than getting it so that it takes the plant out. But I mean, yeah, anthracnose is a fantastic example of a disease that can be useful in that situation. I think the key is that the folks, listening to us need to understand, we all have an understanding of percent and how little or on conversely how much a 2 or 3% stand of Poa annua is. When you start thinking about a 5,000 square foot putting green, if you have 5% Poa annua, that's a lot of area of your green that you are not going to be happy with getting rid of it on a wholesale basis if what's left behind is sand. And so I think that's one of the things that a lot of folks dramatically underestimate what percentage of plant population they have. Just like, dollar spot is a good example of it with small spots. It's routinely overestimated how much disease is present versus what's actually there. It's kind of the opposite problem. Wow, I've got tons of disease, and it's like, no, you got about 1.5%, but you think it's it's a lot. It's often more than you think, and then even if you correctly estimated it, like Dr. Sorokin just commented, if you think you have 5% POA, you probably have 10 to 15%. And even if you've correctly estimated it, 10% of 5,000 square feet is a large area of your green. It's not trivial, even at those small percentages.
And the other thing, that's interesting about, Poecure on greens, to me, we've looked at it in push-up greens and USGA spec greens, and the activity's been higher in push-up greens. That led to further research that's been published on, well, why? And we know that the uptake is all root uptake driven, and there's an argument to be made that those plants in a push-up green are going to be more shallow rooted than they would be in a USGA spec green. I know that irrigation post Poecure treatment is really important to move that into the root zone. If you let it sit on the surface, it's not going to do what you want it to do. And we've tried this in a number of different scenarios. We have gotten results in bentgrass green trials. We had fairly decent results in our ultra dwarf greens trials this year on ultra dwarf Bermuda grass. When we put Poecure into higher height of cut scenarios, we have struggled to get the performance out of it that one would want. And I don't know, Matt, if you've seen that in New Jersey, looking at maybe fairway or even rough height turf. We just haven't seen the performance that we've seen on greens in our trial work here in Tennessee.
Yeah, we've seen the same thing. I don't know if it's a function of, as that height of mowing increases, the root length of the annual bluegrass increases, and thus makes it less susceptible to the herbicide. Like you were mentioning with the push-up green, I don't know yet, but we've seen the same thing, and there are higher rates suggested for higher mowing height turf than on a putting green, but we've followed those rates and just haven't seen the efficacy. So.
And yeah, I think, Brandon, you said the question came from New Zealand. I think Campbell Chemicals, Nadeem Zakrayat, who's the rep who always comes to GIS every year, has been kind of the lead on getting Poecure into Australia, which is, right next door. And that might be a good contact, John, if you can get with Nadeem and kind of learn about some of the things they've seen in the Australian market with it, that could get you started. And Brandon, did you say we had a rough stock bluegrass question that came in?
No, but you can talk about it if you want.
I wish I had something positive to say. Matt and I were commenting before we went live here that it's kind of what our inboxes blow up to this time of year is rough stock bluegrass and tall fescue lawns here. And I imagine, Matt, in New Jersey, it's in every lawn, regardless of species.
How do I get rid of it out of a Kentucky bluegrass stand?
Yeah, we have no selective options in the South, Matt. Can you give us a silver bullet from New Jersey to solve all of the transition zone problems?
You're like a cure? You're looking for a cure?
Yeah, grass out of a grass is tough, but Poa out of a Poa
is even harder.
That's even harder.
Yeah, no, there's really nothing. There used to be an option, in sod production, there was a special label of Sulfuron, but that's no longer available. So yeah, unfortunately there's nothing. It's funny though, kind of reading Devin's crop science paper about the perenniality of Poa sort of makes you wonder how similar Poa trivialis and Poa annua are. Maybe we think of them differently, but there's a lot of similarities. Poa annua actually hangs around longer into the summer than Poa triv, but they both exhibit perennial nature that depending on how you manage the turf and where you are located, they kind of go dormant during the summertime. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and I know we've done lots of screening because it's a common question. And I know NC State's done a bunch of work on this, and Purdue did some work on it. And we've looked at applications of Progress, Exonerate, Turflawn ester, Tenacity, combinations thereof. And I shared some of this, I think, in one of our Turf Tuesday sessions from 2020. And you can make some headway and think you've won the war, and then come back at a year later and you haven't. We had some really promising treatments maybe 60, 70 days after application that looked really good, and then when you came back and rated them the next spring, that activity was all lost. Those plants had recovered. So yeah, I feel for the lawn care operators out there that are fighting this, because we don't have any real good recommendations other than spade, shovel, and reseed.
Yeah, it's a weed that likes wet areas, not a lot of sun exposure. So sometimes those areas it just gets really, really challenging. So I think that some of the stuff, like you mentioned earlier, Brandon, with mowing height, those little things can start to help. And especially like we talked about with annual bluegrass, especially in tall fescue. And if we compare that to perennial ryegrass or Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue likes to be mown a little higher. And anecdotally, I've just seen some more severe infestations of things like annual bluegrass and Poa triv, where that tall fescue is mowed low, because again, it just likes to be at 3 or 4 inches. And that also gives you opportunities to reduce your irrigation frequencies as well. If you're mowing higher, you've got deeper root systems, and you can, start to shift the landscape a little bit in terms of, your desirable grasses are just going to compete better.
Yeah, we had 2 questions come in. They were kind of related via email before we started today about application timing. One of these was from your part of the world, Matt, up in Pennsylvania, and one was from Tennessee. And here, through all the research that we've done over the past several years, it's been an opportunity to look at when to make an optimal application, and spring is not that time. For us, all of our recommendations are for fall. I'll share my screen really quick here and show one slide. If I can figure out how to do this. So this is one slide. This is a former graduate student's work. She looked at Poa emergence in Bermuda grass in Tennessee for 2 years, 2019 and 2020. 2019 is on the left and 2020 is on the right. And what she saw, if we look at this, the blue line is a model predicting what would happen, and the green is an actual. We see that we start to get an uptick of emergence in, say, mid-September, and then by the middle of October, things really kind of jump out of the ground. And we have been since then have been recommending that you make applications for Poa control kind of in this orange band, sometime between the 15th of October into early November. And, if you look at why that might be, in both years, we weren't able to predict when emergence would start happening or the rate that it would start changing at. But we do know that if you come in that mid-October window, you're going to have 40 to 50% of your annual bluegrass population emerged, and another 40 to 60% yet to come. So if we have a mixture of pre and post chemistry applied at that time, well, now we've got 2 modes of action, which is going to help us from a resistance management standpoint and a perenniality standpoint. And it's just an easier ask of everything involved. Those plants that are new germinated seedlings, they're a lot easier to control Halloween when they're not even thrown a tiller yet than they are come late March, early April. And if we have a pre-emergence treatment with that, if we put it on the ground on Halloween, it's a much easier ask of the residual piece to carry us into the spring than if we had started that, say, 2 months earlier and made that application on Labor Day. So for, at least for this region, our optimal time to make applications is going to be in that mid-October to early November timeframe. Is that the same for you, Matt?
Talking about a pre-emergence application timing?
Kind of in general. I mean, what would your recommended option be for the Mid-Atlantic or New Jersey to make an application for control?
So is this going back to the question about annual bluegrass control on a lawn?
Yeah, I mean, we have two questions here. A lot of it's, one of them is lawn specific, asking, should I make a pre-application in the fall? Should I spray now? What's the best option?
Yeah, so a lot of times what's been done here is typically looking at either true pre's or true pre's followed by, post-emergence applications, and usually coupling those two, not necessarily in a tank mixture, but you could, but applying a pre-emergent in mid-August, early September, which is when we're going to get our big flush of annual bluegrass germination. That's one strategy. And that strategy on its own is likely to be somewhat effective. I think the efficacy varies depending on how you manage that surface. If we're talking about a bentgrass fairway where we've been managing with fungicides and frequent irrigation to keep it healthy all summer, that might be a situation where I don't want to look as much to a pre-emergence herbicide because I've already got an established stand and might not have a big flush of germination because I've got a lot of, biotypes that I've essentially are perennial or behaving as a perennial. And then in a lawn situation where, you might have more bluegrass that behaves as an annual, that pre-emergent might be more effective. But yeah, so we're looking at mid-August or to, early September as a time where if you look at a pre-emergence like prodiamine or dithiopyr, those could work fairly well. And then coupling that with, if you've got a severe problem, a post-emergence program with something like a mesotrione or an ethofumicate to control the existing plants that are there, the perennial plants that survived the summer, those sorts of things, that coupling those together can work fairly well. But it depends on the situation. The disadvantage of the true pre is you can't really do a lot of the seeding that we commonly do in lawns and that kind of thing in this part of the country, which is why I think traditionally those pre-emergents aren't used quite as much as you get farther north, and we look more towards post-emerge, again, because we want to incorporate that seed. So I think one of the things that I've seen from the research and just in person is if you look at herbicide programs, if you can couple multiple herbicide programs together, maybe something in the fall and then something in the following spring, that works that typically works better. That's research coming from kind of across the northern United States. And then the opportunity to incorporate seeding if the lawn is particularly thin or if the stand is particularly thin can help, but it does get a little difficult. I think just seeding without an herbicide is not often very successful, and we've seen this in a lot of overseeding work over the years, just because if you've got a heavy infestation of POA, that POA seed bank is going to be so much more competitive than any amount of desirable seed you can put out. So you've got all these different factors kind of working together, and I guess those are just things to consider.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
anything to add?
And I'll share. So this is from our trial work this year, and we look at treatments at 3 locations across the state, and then try to pick out what was in the top statistical grouping at all 3 locations. And so this is a list of treatments, rates, and timings. And again, it's all Tennessee specific. But to your point, Matt, there's really only one true pre-treatment on here. I guess there's 2. The Regal Star 2 in September is a true pre, and then a sequentials program with Crew, which is a new herbicide from Corteva with dithiopyr and isoxamin That was in the top statistical grouping for us at 3 sites. The rest of these are all mixtures. We have more tools available for fall treatment than we do any sort of true pre or spring window, and just it's a better biological time to make that application. You know, one of the things for us that you don't have in New Jersey, but we have in warm season turf is, you know, we have lots of glyphosate resistance issues here. We have lots of ALS resistance issues here. You start to lose ALS inhibitors as a post-control option in Bermuda grass for resistance purposes. That suite of tools is really, really narrow. And if you take glyphosate off the table in the niche of the transition zone where we have dormant Bermuda grass, the pie gets even smaller. So moving into this space of mixtures in the fall has really been important, I think, for turfgrass managers in this region. Interesting, Matt, and I share this with you because I know you've been working with dithiopyr and goosegrass, and it's a little bit off topic, but I was surprised by the performance of Crew in our trial work because it was applied at sites where we knew we had prodiamine resistant Poa annua, and dithiopyr in the same mode of action group working as well as it did was surprising to me. And I know you've seen some niches in your work with goosegrass where you're seeing maybe it's not a 1-for-1 with prodiamine resistance conferring resistance to dithiopyr and vice versa.
Yeah, because we found a lot of dithiopyr resistant goosegrass in the state. So we started looking into it a little bit more, and dithiopyr and prodiamine are in the same group, WSSA group 3, so they get all the same resistance coding. The mode of action of dithiopyr is not understood, but it's thought that it actually binds to a different target site than prodiamine. So possibly, a prodiamine resistant plant, depending on the mechanism of resistance, might be controlled by dithiopyr. But that could be what's going on there. But yeah, I think there's a lot to look into there.
Well, and it's interesting too with, you take pronamide, the active in curb, which is again in the same group 3, and we can see it have activity in some situations where we may have evolved prodiamine resistance. And it's, I think, one where the exact mechanism isn't really understood. And working with courses here this winter, and this was mainly in ultra dwarf greens where they've moved into curb programs for controlling ALS resistant Poa annua in Tiff Eagle or Champion or Mini Verde. It's really, really integral that those applications are watered in scenarios where they sit on the leaf. You're just setting yourself up to fail, and they really have to get in the root zone in order to do what we want on it's a herbicide that enters the plant through the roots. If we don't put it by the roots, it's not going to get into the plant. And I know Brandon, you and I think Jim Kearns' group, they have done a lot of that with fungicide placement too, right? Where we've got to get it into where we want it to do the work.
Yeah, almost nearly every application for a systemic fungicide, a light watering in is going to be beneficial in terms of your success. It's fairly rare. There's only a handful of diseases that I can think of where you might want to just leave it right up on the surface. And there's certainly good examples where leaving it with whatever your normal spray volume, as long as you're over a gallon per 1,000 in spray volume, you're probably getting enough material down a little bit lower in the canopy to get some uptake and kind of cover the whole plant. Because that's the other piece of this is that certainly with some of the work that we did with Jesse Benelli and his PhD, when we started looking at the models for xenobiotic chemical transport in plants, there's 2 models. One's a short stature model and one's the regular plant model. And the regular plant model is corn at 6 or 8, 9 feet. And then the short stature model is wheat at 2.5 or 3 feet. I don't think we have a real good handle on exactly what happens when you're talking about a plant that's being mown at 1/8 of an inch and where that transport, how that transport works and how it moves. But certainly we've seen watering in helps with almost every disease that you can think of.
We've got one last question that just popped in to the box here. Question is, have we done any experiments with phenoxaprop to control Poa trib? Phenoxaprop is the active ingredient in a claim extra. We have looked at that and seen short-term efficacy, but not long-term control. I don't know, Matt, if you've done anything with the claim and cool season turf in New Jersey on Poa trib.
No, we haven't.
And
Yeah, I think the challenge is how do you control this perennial weed, get enough herbicide in it over a short time where it won't come back in the fall. I think that's, like you said earlier, Jim, I think anytime you're evaluating an herbicide with Poa trib, you want to look at not how well did it do 6 weeks after, 8 weeks after, but how well did it do, the following year, almost looking at it a year out, or at least into the next fall if you can. So, yeah.
And and it could be one of those things that the industry kind of figures out as we go. Sometimes that happens, that practitioners stumble upon ways to do things, and then we figure out why they're working. I know we've got some lawn care operators here that swear spot applications of phenoxaprop can do the job, and when we put it in trial work, we just don't see it. So I think it's one of those weeds where there's a lot more to learn about how to take that out of a tall fescue lawn or any other turf. And so one more question here before we sign off. Would Poecure be a possible addition to a preventative rotation program on newly seeded greens? I'd have to double check the label, Mark. Gut instinct, knowing it's a root uptake herbicide. I've had a little bit of heartburn telling you to put that on newly seeded bentgrass. But I reserve right to review the label and old data before fully committing to any answer. But yeah, I think that once you're mature and established and feel really confident that the bentgrass is healthy, I think going on it early, particularly, and this is a golf course that we'll be renovating with new bentgrass, using it as a preventative tool to keep infestations down, that makes some sense because there is some residual with the treatment. Anything you want to add there, Matt, with Poecure on new bentgrass?
Yeah, I think just it's gotta be careful till that bentgrass gets established. Looking at something like a paclobutrazol might be, if you're worried about annual bluegrass in the seed bank, is something you look somewhere that direction. A paclobutrazol or chlorprimidol cutlass.
And the other thing too, Mark, is that in a new renovation situation where you're going to be bringing new mix in, there's pretty good data on new sand-based root zones that trying to withhold phosphorus as long as you can in a new bentgrass establishment is going to help discourage Poa annua infestation into that new bentgrass. So I would really take a hard look at your grow-in program and see how low you can push the phosphorus. And it's probably lower than you think you can.
Yeah, I believe was sufficiency levels around 10 ppm.
Yeah, it's very low.
Yeah. So yeah, look at your mix, and then also look at the top dressing sand as you grow in. Hopefully that top dressing sand is relatively low in P. Sometimes though they can be higher than you think, so you might want to get that tested as well.
So I'm going to show this really fast before we sign off. Not that this is our GCSAA approval code for today. So if you want GCSAA certification credits, please note that code and submit it to GCSAA. If you are watching this on YouTube as a recorded session, you want to make sure that you submit this event date, the actual event date of May the 4th, not the date at which you are watching the YouTube video. So make sure that if you're watching this recorded, that you note today's date in your submission. But I will leave that there. I appreciate you guys joining me and talking all things POA. This is fun, and I'm sure we could probably do one of these every year because the POA questions never stop.
It's funny how that plant works.
Yeah, it is. It is a funny one. So I think we'll leave it there. Thanks everybody for listening and joining us. We'll be back the first Tuesday in June. I believe, Dr. Horvath, we're gonna deep dive on brown patch in June. So that'll certainly be timely for the transition zone as we get into a little bit more of our summer season. So until then, we'll see everyone the first Tuesday in June, and thanks for listening.